let's start with opening statements. Okay, so
Sure. We don't have much of an opening statement, so you
all right,
guys can
yeah,
go
yeah. Okay,
first.
so we don't have an opening statement either, but I've done a couple of these debates. So we believe that the definition or quote unquote definitions of systemic racism can fall under the following. We believe it can be a culture created by the system that now the system disproportionately targets. We believe it can be a system that either disproportionately affects people by the language of the law or by the intent of the law. This is generally reaffirmed through the belief that one race is superior to another. And this can also be in examples of specific instances of institutions that a system upholds. For instance, I kind of hear myself echoing, but if a system upholds another system that is systematically racist, we would also count that as systemic racism because the system is upholding it. And we believe if the system upholds another system of racism, that can also be systemic racism under the definition. And so if you guys want me to go into some examples of systemic racism, we can do so, as the burden of proof is on us to prove it exists.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. Give us an example.
All right, perfect. So here's an example. So I'll go under each definition we've given and then give one example that fits that definition. So our first definition, this definition is the system created a culture that now the system disproportionately affects. So we all know that, during the Jim Crow times and during specific impacts of like either redlining or Jim Crow or the Great Society Act, we understand that the system created a culture. Now, what was this culture? Now, according to a Harvard study, during these times, African Americans obviously increased in single motherhood rates. They became a lot more materialistic to prove self-worth, and that isn't inherently bad. However, we understand that since that culture was created by the system, and the culture of like rapping, that would be something that derived from African American communities in the 80s and 90s or 70s, because of like the struggle they were going through, and music was a way to escape that. We understand that like buying a lot of materialistic items such as like chains, expensive clothing and shoes also became popular due to that quote unquote rap culture or gang culture. We also understand that since Jim Crow, we understand that during Jim Crow, a lot of African Americans were made poorer or couldn't get a lot of opportunities. So we understand that if you're poor, you're more likely to be in a gang or do violence, or not violence but crime. And so when they resort to gangs, it goes into this whole gang culture thing. And so we obviously understand that lasting effects doesn't necessarily mean systemic racism. However, the system back then created a culture that system disproportionately affects now. And so that's why we believe systemic racism exists under that definition. Now, I'm not sure if you want to take this one by one or you want me to explain everything at once, or do you guys want to kind of talk about that first?
Wait. Are you guys okay if I admit someone, but I'm just gonna put them on mute?
Oh, sure, no
Are they
problem. As long
Okay.
as they're on mute,
Muted,
sure.
yeah.
Donald Trump, interesting. All right, yep.
Um,
All right. All right, so would you guys like to refute some of the claims I made? Maybe you want to either refute the definition or refute that the system didn't create that culture, but that culture stemmed from something else.
Are you talking about redlining? Did you bring
No,
redlining?
we're talking about how like the Great Society Act created a culture, and that culture disproportionately affects African Americans now.
Okay.
But we can go
how,
into redlining if you would like.
Not yet. Not yet.
All right, all right.
yes. I would like to ask you how. Wait. Repeat it again, because I forgot my question. Sorry.
Oh, that's fine. Okay, so under our definition of, or our first definition of systemic racism, it would be the system creating a culture, maybe let's just say 50 years ago, right? They created that culture. And then that culture is now disproportionately affected. And this is due to them creating that culture. If they had never created the culture, no one would be disproportionately affected. And this culture can be tied to things like materialism, where they want to prove their self-worth through material items such as chains, right? Or being famous with rap music, things like that. And then we also understand how it created a rap culture. We understand how, since African Americans couldn't get as many education opportunities back then, they were statistically more likely to be, poorer than at least like a white person. And this created a gang culture, for instance, where since poor people are more likely to turn to violence and gangs, more African Americans were turning to do so. And then when they had kids, they taught those same ideals. We understand that since it goes down through generations, since the system created that culture, that it still has to be systemic racism today, because that system actively upholds and fights against that culture that it itself created.
Okay, so you were talking about disparities, or do you want to mention like any specific disparities?
Disparities in wealth, for instance, we acknowledge disparity doesn't equal discrimination. However, under our definition of if the system created that culture, I mean, do you think anything else created the culture of materialism, gang violence, etc.? Do you think anything else would have created that culture besides the system, which actively fought against African Americans?
Wait, so how would a system that was actively fighting against African Americans create a culture for African Americans?
It would create a culture for African Americans, because we understand culture can be changed by a lot of different things. Culture can be changed by environments, right? And we understand the government created an environment for African Americans that wasn't pleasant. Things like, we're not specifically saying like redlining like happens to this day, or maybe Braden is. However, we understand it has some lasting effects, and so we understand culture can be created by one of about three things. It can be changed by environment. It can be changed by specific outcomes, or it can be changed by specific how people treat you. It can be changed by a lot of different things, and so it can be changed by let's go over them all. It can be changed by the environment. We understand a lot of cultures have been changed by its environment, whether this be English culture turning into American culture, because of the change in environment and the change of want to do something else. We understand that can change through environment. So let's look at that environment African Americans were put through. So like under Jim Crow, they didn't have access to a good education under Jim Crow. They didn't have access like water fountains, restaurants, social services, everything, right? And so their culture was edited or altered. You could tie this back to slavery, because they were, taken from their mothers at like the age of 5. And culture has to be passed down through generations. You don't automatically know your culture, right? It has to be taught to you somehow. However, it cannot be taught to you if you're taken away from your like civilization and then put into like a white household. And then we go to Jim Crow. We understand how their environment put onto them by the system was unpleasant and not good. And so that's how they created the culture, through an environmental kind of way, putting them in bad environments, etc.
Right. So here are the three processes of change for culture, right? So forces at work within a society, contact between societies, and then changes in the natural environment.
Yeah, so like changes in the environment is kind of like what I explained, and then
so those are
yeah.
Mark just went over all those. But
Yeah, so we just went over an example of how its environment, forced onto it by the system, edited their culture, and then that culture is disproportionately affected to this day because that system created the culture, thus being systemic racism.
So you still think it exists from a long time ago, right?
I think it
Not
exists. I think it
necessarily.
exists today because it existed back then. Because since it existed back then, it created a culture, and that culture was changed from the environment. Their environment was altered in a negative way, right? They were brought over by slave ships in 1605, I think was the first one, but to America later on. And when the culture changed, the system put them in that environment. They put them in that area. Therefore, the system is automatically responsible for putting them in that environment. And since we already demonstrated how environment changes culture, the burden of proof is on you now to dispute our claims of how culture changes with environment, or that that culture was created by some other external factor.
So you would agree that many disparities today are a result of culture, right?
Yeah, we would agree. Yeah, exactly. So
That's
if you guys mentioned like culture, we would argue that the system created that culture, therefore it is still systemic racism. So if we were to, I'm not going to strawman you here, but if we were to example say, drugs, right?
Wait,
What?
wait. Sorry. You can continue.
All right. So if we were to say, for instance, like African Americans consume drugs on a more basis, like more than white people on weekly and monthly, and you guys said, oh well, that's more culture. We would argue that culture was created by the system, therefore it still counts under systemic racism. We obviously
And
know that disparity doesn't equal discrimination. However, if the system created the culture and it disproportionately affects that culture, that would still be systemic racism.
right.
Mm.
So do you guys want to dispute that?
Yeah. Do you have a contention?
Hold on.
Okay.
So basically, our main contention is they created the culture and then they targeted it.
Yeah.
I think Mike wanted to do something.
Do you have a contention?
Not really.
Hi, bro.
I
So,
I guess yeah.
I mean, if you don't have a contention, what were you really preparing for? Were you preparing for if we were gonna say like, they consume drugs more or get incarcerated more?
No, I was talking. I'm prepared more like the criminal justice system stuff.
Okay.
Oh, we got not-
I mean, I guess we'll wait for Mike to get back, but
yeah.
I wasn't really ready for culture.
Oh yeah, I always choose the thing that nobody's ready for. Braden can agree.
Yeah, I hate debating, Mark. It makes me want to kill myself. It makes me want to delete my 71-page document
Yeah.
because it's useless against him. It
Yeah,
has
exactly.
Okay. Hello.
All right,
Hello.
Mike.
It
All right,
is-
Mike. So
Yeah.
basically-
Something happened. Yeah. Wait.
That's
You were
fine.
talking about culture, right?
Yeah, so we're saying like the culture was created by the system, and then the system targets that culture today. Therefore, it is systemic racism. And then your friend conceded that he did not have an argument against that, so he was wondering if you had an argument against that.
Yeah. I don't think we were really prepared for the topic of culture. So and I think we were mostly prepared for like the justice system, drug rates, and
Well, we
all
can
that.
go into that, and then I can show you why it ties into culture. So, for instance, I'll say okay, so I'll say African Americans are 8 times more likely to be incarcerated for homicide, and you're gonna tell me that African Americans commit homicide at an 8 times higher rate, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So then we'd say that's because of culture, but that culture was created by the system.
and then the culture targeted that system, and then the
System targeted the culture, yeah.
exactly.
Therefore, we have to look at the bigger picture here. We understand that the small picture, it may not be systemic racism. Maybe it's individual cases. However, if we look at the bigger picture of why African Americans are committing 8 times more homicide, it all leads back to that system, the culture, it all leads back to the culture the system itself created.
Is there a contention?
So you're basically tying everything into culture.
Oh
correct?
yeah, we understand that it has to be culture, and the reason why it has to be culture is we understand that culture is essentially like how a lot of people base their acting off over. We understand that like a lot of Americans eat fast food because that's basically become our culture. We understand how culture affects a lot of things, and so when you guys are like saying like a disparity doesn't equal discrimination, like if we say like African Americans are incarcerated more for 8 times more than white people for homicides, and you guys say kind of like how Mike was saying, they're like 8 times more likely to commit homicide. We have to see, okay, so why are they 8 times more likely to commit homicide? Okay, well we can tie this back to culture that the system created, and since the system created the culture, and then the culture is disproportionately affected by the system intentionally, then it's systemic racism by definition.
We really don't have that much on culture.
Well, culture is everything in systemic racism because you can look
Yeah.
at the disparities or the discrimination, but that has to start from somewhere. It has to stem from somewhere, and it all stems from culture. we don't necessarily argue that it's racist because it's racist. We argue that it's racist because the culture was created by a racist system. I think you and I and Mike and Britton all agree that the system was racist in the 1920s and 30s. I'm
Yeah,
sure you guys
correct.
would probably argue that it's not racist anymore. However,
Yep.
it's not racist towards African Americans, yet it caused African Americans to create a culture in the 20s and 30s that exists today. And it created it in the
Right.
30s,
So
40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, right? It
right.
probably
So
still
what we're
creates it
saying is
today.
the existence of obvious systemic racism in the 1920s and 30s created a culture which now the system targets. So that has to mean systemic racism.
Because it's the
Okay.
system being racist.
Yes. Okay. How does the system target the culture
Yeah,
or
perfect. Okay, so
African Americans?
all right,
Yeah,
perfect. So I got this. All right. So we're not necessarily saying that it targets African Americans. We're saying it targets the culture. And it's targeting the culture that was disproportionately forced onto African Americans. So,
Yes, but how?
how are they okay? Well, I mean, I could just say,
policing.
I mean, we could say policing, for example, how they police poor communities more, or they police communities with more crime.
And because the system created this culture of more crime, that means that when they over police these areas, that is systemic racism because they're policing and targeting an area where created the culture which is now crime.
Yeah, let me
So you're
give you
saying
this
they're
hypothetical, Mike, or right wingers. Let me give you this hypothetical. So let's just say this. So I put you, um, let's just say, when you're born, right? I train you to become a killer, right? And when you're 15 years old, I put you into a society where killing is no longer allowed. You've been trained nothing else but to kill. Now you could say
Mhm.
we're not targeting you because you're black, right? We're targeting you because you're killing. However, if I trained you to kill since you were born, I put that culture of killing onto you, and now you are disproportionately affected by the society that says no more killing. And we can attribute this to African Americans, not because I'm saying like they're trained to kill from birth. However, the system put specific circumstances on them. They put like poorer wealth on them. They put not as good education, uh, things like that. And like gang violence that they had to turn to because they were poor because of the system. And so, like I just established with my hypothetical, if the system created it and then the system disproportionately affects it, that would be systemic racism. So if the system 50 years ago caused a bunch of African Americans to be poor and to turn to gang violence, and then the system targets gang violence, that'd be systemic racism because they're the ones who caused that culture of gang violence.
hold on. Can you say how it created that gang violence? I really
Sure, yeah,
didn't.
definitely. So we understand about 50 years ago, or like 80 years ago,
Mhm.
we understand that 80 years ago or 50 years ago, they had like Jim Crow, right? And so with
Yes.
Jim Crow, what happened was African Americans couldn't get good access to education. They couldn't get access to better jobs. They couldn't get access to restaurants, all these opportunities, right? White people could. And so when a lot
Mhm.
of white people were getting these opportunities and black people couldn't, we obviously understand that a lot of African Americans had to do one or two things. Since they couldn't afford a lot of like housing and stuff because they couldn't get good opportunities, a lot of poor African Americans turned to gang violence. Why? Because things like selling drugs or gang violence, it's an easy way to make money. It's high risk,
Mhm.
but it's an easy way to make money. And since the system forced the environment of bad opportunities on them, they had to turn to something.
I don't get how the system forced them to go
You
into bad.
you don't see how the system made them poor?
Not really.
The system
I
made
mean,
them. Wait, are you saying so Jim Crow didn't make any African American person poor, or didn't make African Americans poor? Is that what you're arguing?
no.
Well,
I,
that's what we are arguing. We're arguing it did. So if you disagree, you can tell us why Jim Crow didn't limit African American opportunities. But I mean, I'm pretty sure it's common knowledge Jim Crow did a lot of things to limit opportunities.
Yes, I'm pretty sure we all agree that Jim Crow laws were terrible.
Yeah,
But what is it called? As time goes on, high school people with high school diplomas, especially the number of blacks with high school diplomas, is rising. And since more of them have high school diplomas, and you have more job opportunities when you have a high school diploma, it would um, eventually they will I don't know how to word this.
No, I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
But let me ask you this: why are African Americans more likely to sell drugs?
Oh,
By the way, if you answer culture, you know what I'm going to say. So you have to answer something else, unless you want to concede that it is culture, and then we just go back to why culture was created by the system. So, are you going to say it's culture, or are you going to say it's something else? I'll take that as it's culture, but I don't want to admit it.
I really don't know how to respond.
Well,
Yeah.
that is what usually happens.
I wasn't really prepared
Yeah,
for
we weren't
culture.
ready for like that type of explanation. We were mostly ready for like common answers, like disparities.
Well,
So
that's kind of what disparities. Oh wait, hold on one second.
yes, but usually regular people can't like do a good job like you. So
You needed to unmute Braden, by the way.
oh wait, what? Oh sorry.
Yeah, but anyways, base. He's not. Are you guys gonna unmute him?
I mean, Mike had. I don't know what Mike's doing.
Okay, well.
Thank you. Jeez, I've been muted for like 30 minutes, and I even made my name let me unmute. I messaged you 30 times in private chat, let me unmute. Wow.
All right. Well, anyways, I mean, you guys. I mean, if you're debating systemic racism and you're gonna argue it's culture, you have to be prepared to say it's culture, and argue culture. You know, you're obviously not arguing African Americans, commit like more crimes on average, because they are like they're lesser than the white race. I hope you're not arguing that. But what was your plan if we were gonna say, okay, so if it's culture, why do you think that culture's there?
I had more stuff like on the like police disparities
Right,
and
so we
shooting
understand
and
this. So can you
sentencing.
give a contention to why the system did not create it, or how it didn't target this culture that it created?
Okay.
I mean, you guys agree that the system created it back then, and we're telling you it disproportionately affects it now. So how could you not concede that systemic racism exists? You either have to concede it exists, or you have to give us some magical argument that would save you guys right now.
I really don't know.
I don't
what
hear
this-
a magical argument.
I don't know where Mike went.
So you want to concede that systemic racism exists?
Hold on, the debate's not even over yet.
Well,
Right, but
I
you
mean,
haven't
it
provided a
kinda
valid
is.
argument the
I
whole
mean,
time.
It kind of is over, but like,
Yeah, you didn't provide a valid argument the whole time. Not the
it
whole
was kind of
time.
just me explaining what systemic racism is.
Yeah.
Just the whole time. It's like story time rather than
And
a
me
debate.
giving like a few little details.
Yeah. I was like the teacher giving the story, and then David Ricardo fan page was like the substitute teacher to like explain stuff, and then you guys were like the students just listening. And now you're both muted, just listening to me.
And
Hi,
they
bro.
can't unmute themselves because the host won't let them unmute. Oh my gosh.
Hi, bro. I mean, this was kind of a fun debate. Do you
Okay.
guys want to do like?
Hello.
Please
I'm
send
back.
me the recording.
Hello?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Unmute
hello.
the right wingers.
All right. I mean, is this
Unmute
kind of the end of the systemic
Wait,
racism
what were you
debate?
saying? I had James.
All right. Well, I
Oh.
mean, what I've kind of been saying the whole time. I'm not sure if you've been like able to like kind of like fully understand our argument. So our argument is we agree the system 80 years ago created a culture. If you want to know how it created it, I think we've already explained that. We talked about environmental culture changes and how the system forced an environment on African Americans with Jim Crow laws. I think we've already explained how that culture was started. And then I think we've explained how that culture's been maintained. And the way it's been maintained is because we see patterns. We see that like Jim Crow, right? That would be considered a pattern. Because we see that how Jim Crow affected them then and created that culture, and then we see how that culture is disproportionately affected now.
So you would okay, usually systemic racism can be defined as laws, policies, or institutions that target one racial or ethnic group.
Wait, didn't we give you our definitions at the beginning and ask if you would refutals to any of them?
Well, I mean, we gave you 3 different definitions of systemic racism,
And we chose one and went with it, and you didn't have any contentions. Also, probably unmute the right wingers because he's probably muted and can't be unmuted.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if he's
Like,
gonna say
there was
anything
other people
anyways,
that
but
were in here.
okay.
All right.
but I mean,
So we gave our definitions at the beginning, asked if you had a contention with any of them. We continued with them the entire time, and you haven't had a contention the entire time.
I mean, we weren't really set up for culture.
Well, I mean,
Again,
culture's the whole thing.
Yeah, I don't really understand if we care.
Yeah, like the
that
bigger picture
were
is
fair.
culture because, like, let's just say we argue, okay, so African Americans are more likely to get denied jobs, and you're like, oh, and you guys are like, well, that has nothing to do with race. That has to do with like names, right? And you guys may argue poorer people are more likely to choose like more distinctive names or profound names, like Malachi, for example. But then we say, okay, well, how has that culture of naming happened? How did that culture of being poor, because we understand that poor people are more likely to choose distinctive names. How did they become poor? And then you guys may argue, oh, okay, well, I mean, I'm not sure if we got a direct response. But let me ask you this, right? Maybe we can kind of like maybe turn the tide in your favor. Hopefully, maybe. Why do you think African Americans are poor today? Like more than white people? Would you argue culture, maybe? Perhaps?
I mean, the richest, I think Asians are the richest in America. If I'm
We're
correct.
not.
Okay, and?
Yeah, that doesn't really have anything to do with
Yeah,
what we're
and?
talking about.
Okay.
Asians have a okay. This actually proves our point because a lot of Asians have a culture or were accepted into America as immigrants. They could only be accepted if they were like really smart, and that created a culture of them. You know, the smartness, right? Because America for a time only accepted people from Asia that were like insanely smart, and so this created a culture of being smart, and so they taught this to their kids, and that's actually proving our point on how culture comes down through generations, because we understand that typically if you are more smart or have a higher IQ, you're more likely to be rich. The top 5 richest people in the world all have IQs over like 140,
Mhm.
like the fifth person being 175. So we understand that's how culture goes down, and the whole argument comes to culture and how was it created. Therefore, you can show us disparity doesn't equal discrimination. However, we can show you that disparity was because of discrimination in the past, and that discrimination in the past caused a culture that is disparate, that has a disparity now because
And that disparity
of
in the
that culture.
past was due to the government,
Yeah, the disparity in the past was due to the government, and then the
and
government
has created a culture now.
and created a culture. Well, created a culture back then that still exists now. Yeah.
And then the government is targeting it now, which means the government is systemically racist.
Yeah.
I have
Okay.
actually never heard this viewpoint.
That's because all
And
my viewpoints are never heard of. That's why they're
yeah,
Yeah.
so I think we can concede that this debate was a failure for us, big time.
Yeah, I would also agree with that.
Yeah.
Can you send me the recording of this actually?
Yeah.
I'll put my email in the chat.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Just
I'll
the
end the
end.
recording now, right?